Hello and welcome to the Gifted Podcast. I am your host, Niraj Mulani, and in the Gifted Podcast, I speak with elite athletes as we try to challenge the misconception that athletes are just some people who are talented or gifted with special abilities at birth. Every week, I am joined by an elite athlete as we try to break down what it truly takes and means to be an athlete. If you're an aspiring athlete or just a casual sports fan, you will definitely enjoy this podcast as I get candid with athletes about their journey, their achievements, moments of heartbreak, and most importantly, moments of hard work and perseverance. Guys, I'm happy to share that the Gifted Podcast is now sponsored by Zenkai Sports, the new disruptor in the performance apparel world. And they have come up with a great offer for the listeners of this podcast. So, stick around till the end and find out about this exciting offer. In today's episode, I welcome Canada's skeleton athlete, Cassie Hawrysh. Cassie has had a very colorful and unique route to finding skeleton. She grew up competing in volleyball, then transitioned to heptathlon, and then to discovering, almost by chance, skeleton. Cassie and I talk about her meteoric rise in the sport, winning medals in the first 2 to 3 years at the World Cups, and also what constitutes an ideal skeleton racer. We also dwell on what it means to be named as an alternate for the Olympics and how do so many athletes navigate that phase of their career. So let's jump right in. Welcome to the Gifted Podcast, Cassie. We're really excited to have you today. How are you doing?
I'm really good. How are you?
All good, all good. While it has taken us a while to come to this point of recording our conversation, but I'm really excited to have you. And I'm generally really intrigued to have guests on the show who have started their career as an athlete much later into their life, so mid 20s, because it gives us hope, individuals like me and the listeners of this podcast, hope that it's never too late to start their career as a professional athlete as well. So let's start there. You picked up the sport of skeleton relatively late when you were 25, finding the sport almost by chance. What about skeleton really resonated with you, and what about it made you feel that this is the sport that you'd want to, pursue a career in?
That's a really good question because I think a lot of people mainly phrase that question like, what were you thinking? Like, why would you just think that throwing yourself headfirst down the side of a mountain was a good idea? But so for me, I think that some of it was twofold. So one, the way that I was introduced to the sport wasn't just simply by saying like, here's the sport, I think you should try it. I actually got to meet the people involved in the sports and through coaching and some of the athletes who were pursuing their Olympic berth for the 2010 games. I actually got to train with them in the summer just as a track and field athlete. So it was very casual, like come on in and do these things. And then I got to try to push a sled like in the indoor, but without actually sliding so that was kind of like they eased me into it before anyone really gave me the idea that this is something I could do. And then the second part of it was after I had tried it, and frankly, like I loved the speed. Basically, even though it is a very equipment-based sport, it has a lot to do with your connection to that piece of equipment. So that became very intriguing to me. I didn't come from any sports that had, it was always just like track was just shoes. Volleyball was just like the nets and the balls, right? But this is like Formula One on a budget. So that was interesting to me. And then I think thirdly, going to see the Olympics in 2010 live in Canada in Whistler and Vancouver really just sealed the deal for me. So at that point, I had tried skeleton, didn't know what I was doing. I was like busting myself up, bruises everywhere. But so the people, that speed and that like ability to go faster and faster, but it all relied on me. And then really watching the success of my future Canadian teammates. I had no idea that they would be teammates of mine like a few years later, winning at the 2010 Olympics really just made my brain go like, yeah, why not? Why not you?
And like you mentioned, you obviously were eased into the sport, but at the end of the day, it's still F1 on a budget and you going downhill face forward. And having had no experience of the sport earlier, how do you muster up the courage to take up such a sport, knowing the risks that are involved, obviously? And there are risks involved in all the sports. But
So I don't think the risks were so much front of mind for me. Sure, it was scary. Like there's there's fear from my first time stepping up to a track with my sled to the very final time I ever slid. There's always fear there. It was that you had to distinguish between fear and panic. Fear is really important. It keeps you alive. It keeps you sharp. Panic can cause a lot of problems. And that was very clear right away. So I have had a number of other experiences in my life, like unrelated to sport, I would say that I can be really cool under pressure. I have a very like high level personality. I can be really bouncy and engaging, but at the same time, in any serious, traumatic moments, I've actually been like really calm. So later I would look back and go like, I think that's what it really tapped into. So all that speed and people have referred to it, and there's books about this, but the flow state, right? So that idea of going into something and being so in tune with it that that's all you can think about, that was unique in this sport, in that I identified it. Like I figured it out right away. Like, oh goodness, like there it is. That's what it is. And I love that and wanted that over and over again. So yeah, there was fear. And at the same time, because I was a bit older, as you mentioned, I was an adult. So at that point, people were like, what are you doing? Shouldn't you be getting a job? And I had already completed school. For everyone listening out there, I was already, a full-fledged journalist and had completed 5 years of school and as an athlete as well. But there were a lot of younger athletes coming up in terms of starting. So there were people that were like 14 years old there. So there was a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, I have to be honest, about not backing away from the challenge in front of a bunch of teenagers. So there was a little bit of like, this is cool. And also a little bit of like, oh, I can't be that person that gave up right away.
But you did have some solid foundation as an athlete from, competing as a volleyball player and as well as an heptathlete. Mm-hmm. How do you think that transition from volleyball to heptathlon to skeleton helped you, obviously not just beat 14-year-olds, but athletes who were older than you as well?
We weren't really beating each other when we were learning, but it was more of an ego thing. Yeah. So the answer there is simple. It was, I had become more humble, and not humble in the way that I didn't believe in myself anymore, but that doing a sport for so long, like volleyball, to the point of my second year of university, then changing schools, finding out that I wasn't able to do volleyball anymore, starting a brand new sport. And if anyone's ever picked up the sport of running, even just as a runner, it's not easy. So when you're joining the university track and field team and suddenly they tell you, oh, well, you're pretty athletic, so we're going to make you a multi-eventer. So all 7 events for the women, where it's, as the men, it's the decathlon and 10 events. I had to just like take a big slice of humble pie. And for the first 2 years as a track athlete, just deal with the fact that I was slow. So starting another sport for a third time, really, I wasn't worried that I wasn't good at it right away, because I'd already gone through that. And I knew how to focus and where to place my energy to get the information I needed. And so that meant like asking questions, and sure, I was hard on myself. I wanted to be good quickly, but I also knew that would come.
And learning the skills of the specific sport obviously is going to take a while, but the athlete mindset that gets developed from the very first sport that you pick up, what were those traits that you would always rely on, and something that you developed during your volleyball and heptathlete career, to basically take advantage of those and apply them to your career in skeleton as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's lots there, but I think the biggest thing that comes to mind right away is just recognizing and believing and knowing, because I'd proved it over and over again, that you can figure anything out, right? You can learn how to do anything. You may not be the absolute top expert at everything, but there will be people around you or that you can turn to help you learn how. And again, being open-minded enough to listen to different perspectives. And I'd say by the time, the end of my professional career competing, like I'm still, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a professional athlete for life, but in competition, like being able to know that when you didn't understand someone, it didn't mean that what they were telling you wasn't the right information, but being able to really communicate, like, I don't understand the way that you're explaining this to me. Is there someone else that can tell me? Is there a different way? So, that maturity as an athlete really shone through, which I think really played to my strengths as in terms of speed to become part of Team Canada. But at the same time, I'm not going to mince words. Like sometimes I just got in my own way. It still happens. You still think you get to that point and you're like, oh, this is as good as I'm going to be. And you think, okay, I should be the best. And then you look around and there's people better than you. And you're like, well, how's this happening? So there's always someone better. And there's also, in that same way, there's a better version of you available as well.
Right. And that being the mental side of the sport that you were relying on, and I'd want to then focus on the physiology side of the sport of skeleton.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think makes the ideal skeleton athlete?
Yeah, we've talked about this. If you lined up, just even if I just spoke to the women of the sport of skeleton and you line them all up, the top 20, even there's really only 100 women usually in the world that are doing this sport. If you line them all up next to each other, they do not look the same. There is no like about this height, about this weight, about this speed. There are so many different factors. And I think that in a sport that relies so much on aerodynamics, there is a little bit of play there, which is fun. So I think more than anything, physiologically, like you do need to be fit. So there's a fitness level there, but that isn't to say like they're not these ripped athletes that look a certain way. It's just like you're healthy, you're strong, you're able to do. So one of the things physiologically that's very strange that has to be taught the most is the push. And the push being that the best way to describe it is a track and field athlete in the blocks, feet in the blocks, hands on the ground. Instead of one of your hands being on the ground, it's on a sled. And you're running in that position, not able to stand up for up to 16 strides. So the beginning drive phase of a sprint. So you'd think of like all these crazy Olympic sprinters, and you watch those first few steps out of the blocks. That's the drive phase. You never get to stand up. So you have these athletes who are trying to create all this power all through the back chain of their body, right? All those muscles through the back and through the back of the legs, through the glutes, and all the way out the feet. And you're not able to use your upper body. So a runner requires most of the time to be very efficient to have their arms. What your arms do, your legs will do. Well, you don't get that. One of your hands is trapped in the sled and the other one is doing this really random kind of movement, but it also kind of crosses your body. There's all kinds of things going on. So that of paramount was the one thing I had to learn the most for my entire career. There was no perfecting that. There was always just fine tuning. And from my experience, I'm not a natural sprinter. Like there are some people that come into the sport that physiologically are great sprinters. You can teach a sprinter how to push and you can teach a slower runner how to push too, but they don't always work out that way. Some sprinters just couldn't figure it out. They just didn't know how. And so more than anything, I think it's that obsessive mindset to be able to visualize something over and over and over again. You don't get to practice this sport very much. So, athletes that compete really only get maybe up to 9 runs really before a race, but a World Cup race, you only get 6. So you get 6 minutes on a track to memorize everything. So you spend a lot of time off the sled doing things, which means same way you're visualizing a lot. So knowing that you're going to have to spend more time in your head can mean that there's a term, the term is like you have really heady athletes that spend a lot of time in their own brains. So being able to manage those two things, knowing that you're going to have to really sit with yourself and do that. So I know that your question was physiological, but the truth is like, I don't think there is a standard of reality for that answer, because I've seen super tall females, super tall men, super short men, super female, like kind of square shaped, kind of really long. I've seen athletes be fast at every physiological shape, and the really, really great ones all have this determined, unwavering, steadfast, obsessive mindset.
That's very heartening to hear, because that's also one of the reasons why we started this podcast, is to then focus on athletes and sports that reward hard work and perseverance. And like you mentioned, there is no one body type, and you can't say that if you aren't born with that body type, you won't be able to achieve much in this sport. So that's very heartening to hear. And it's also intriguing to then see, especially there have been a few skeleton races that I have also interacted in the past, and coincidentally, they also had a track and field background behind them. And then having to go through that earned learning process, like you mentioned, not being able to stand up and then one of their hands is on the sled, and then relearning this entire way of sprinting and taking those initial strides. It does take a lot of effort and constant repetition. And that's where I think a lot of the athletes are then distinguished.
Yeah, 100%. And I think To your point, a lot of athletes are found in the track and field community. But that isn't to say that's the only place they get found. I think in North America in particular, there's just a lot of athletes that end up kind of in that realm. And some of the connections in coaching was the same thing. I just had some connections in track and field, but there's been like synchronized swimmers and equestrian riders and football players. And like, it depends a lot of, in terms of body types, I guess I will say there is a little bit more of a lean towards a more slender athlete, but there are some exceptions to that rule too. The push is a really important piece, but have always been an advocate for the fact that, you look at some of the results, even from the women's races these years and this past year, and some of the people that end up on top of the podium don't have fast pushes. What is that about? Well, they're really, really good drivers. So, and their equipment, right? There's a whole other conversation here about the equipment too. So there's all these factors. And that's what I loved about this sport was that, yeah, there was lots of unlearning, but there was also opportunities to edge out a competitor in a way that you wouldn't expect. You might line up next to them and say like, oh, well, your push time's this, there's no way you're going to win. And then you'd go ahead and win because you did something differently, or you had a different setup, or you took a better line and you made up one. In a sport that measures to the 100th of a second, every single thing matters. Where you breathe, where you blink, where you look, where you steered the sled that one time last time between two runs. So it helps even out the playing field a little bit. And that's really what I loved, because I didn't grow up wanting to be an Olympian. I wasn't like, this is what I'm going to do. I loved volleyball, but for the listeners, I'm only 5'7", so I'm not super tall. And in that world, I knew I wasn't likely to go to Olympics, right? And track and field, I started late. So I was doing a lot of unlearning myself for 5-6 years. So, it wasn't as if I didn't know I could be good, but to be the best in the world, to be among the best in the world and be able to take that title was something that kind of came as a surprise. But then when it was there, you realize like, yeah, this is where I belong.
And you had a meteoric rise in the sport itself, winning multiple medals in the first 2 to 3 years of your career and breaking into the national team really quickly. Could you tell us about some of your World Cup wins at that time, and what sort of aspirations did you set for yourself during those initial years, especially after such wins? And you'd be thinking, well, the sport is easy, eh?
Yeah, I guess it could look easy. It was a big, big mental challenge for me. And one of the things that I did to try and deal with that when I made the World Cup team was every week after a race, I would write about it. And I posted that on my blog at the time. And I would do that because it was the only way for me to like unload all of the stress from that week and then try and put it away. But okay, so how did I feel during some of those wins? It was amazing, but my aspirations was to stay on the team. So the thing about the Canadian team, especially at the time, was that it was so competitive, and to have made the team at the beginning of the season didn't mean I was going to stay on the team for the rest of the year. And there were always people nipping at your heels, like on lower circuits, just waiting for you to mess up. And truthfully, that's what we do. As much as we're supporting each other, it's very much an individual sport. At the end of the day, you are responsible for you. So I was doing everything I could to just focus on what I needed to focus on and not look around worrying about what everyone else was doing. At the same time, I really wanted to have fun. And I know everyone says that, but it's really hard to do when it's your job, because you eat, sleep, breathe, and like dream about this one thing all the time. You make no decisions 24 hours a day that don't have some relevance to your sport. And I didn't have a lot of hobbies anymore. I became so obsessed. So making time while I was on tour, traveling to these really cool places around the world to actually go and see some of those things and make friends with other teams and just connect in a way that was authentically Cassie was really important. And it helped me stay true to my personality, and that fun showed up in the race instead of being super stressed. Because when you go from like no support, maybe one coach, no cameras, no caring, it's just like completely different on lower circuits, to cameras, audiences, a team of 6 coaches, everybody's there, all the other teams are there to watch you. It's like night and day. So nothing prepares you for that. You're just like, and now you're at World Cup level. Good luck. And here's the camera like 2 inches away from you while you're standing at the block trying to prepare to hurdle yourself down this track that maybe, and in many cases for me, I hadn't seen. As you said, it was a meteoric rise, as in I skipped a bunch of steps along the way. I went like is the equivalent in the Canadian papers, they'd say it was like you were minor league hockey straight to the NHL. You just barely had any opportunity to catch your breath. And then there you are on the world stage. So a lot of the places I went were new. And I just made a point of being very clear in my communication with the coaches of what I needed. And in some cases, they were coaching athletes that had been around for like 12, 15 years. They didn't really need the coaches to tell them where to steer anymore, whereas I did. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. You need to tell me, like, what is the steer plan? Give it to me super simple. I don't care how you normally coach. Like, this is what I need. Please give that to me. And then I'll do the rest. It's my job, and at the same time, worrying about equipment. So it was asking for a lot of help, which is not easy for high performance people. Usually you're like, I'll do it myself. Asking for a lot of help, being really honest. And again, just trying to enjoy the process. The wins were great, but I honestly ended up, so you get medals 1 through 6 in sliding sports, like up to 6th place. And my best finish was a team finish, which was a cool gold medal with Kaylee Humphreys and Lyndon and, Eric Nielsen at the time for the men's skeleton. And actually they combine all the sliding disciplines and we raced together. And that was probably one of the most fun races I've ever had. And it showed that video on the internet still. I love watching it and being like, that was sliding for me. That was like this experience with other nations, the challenge to just be 100th better than everyone else. And when I think back to those moments, the reason I know that I was where I was meant to be was they're still so vivid, even, and so in some cases, like the hard times just kind of fade away.
And especially, I think, like you mentioned, they're so vivid. And I think one of the reasons why such memories are vivid, because you are in that flow state that we referred to earlier. And it's so easy to recollect those memories because you were in that flow and everything that you're doing was slow motion. You're able to recollect everything.
Yeah.
And combining that to say now you graduating to the World Cup stage without having a lot of experience and having that camera in your face 2 meters away and calculating every move that you do. How do you try and get into that zone, knowing all the distractions that are around you?
You control what you can control. So, I mean, music's a big thing. You'll find for me, like I would always have particular podcasts or playlists that I was listening to. It really depended on my mood. People ask those questions. Some people had the same playlist all the time, but it depended on how the week before went and what I needed the day of the race. But you see a lot of athletes warming up and there is not a lot of like really glamorous warm-up areas in sliding sports. It's usually like a parking lot or a wooden deck, or it's nuts that you think about, these world-class athletes are warming up on this gravel and some snowy area. But that's the deal. And you warm up there and you'd have headphones on and just get as sweaty as you could, get in your space. For me, it was like a lot of just, as I said, visualization. So like closing your eyes and just spending time. You'd have like your little space in your warm-up area and maybe in the start house. And that was just your zone. So you get in your zone and you respect each other in that way. You'd all be in the start house together. And yeah, you find a pattern, you find a system that works for you. And always remember that you need to be flexible because things are going to go wrong. People are going to get in your space. People are going to ask you questions. They're going to trip in front of you, or, something's going to happen. Your zipper is going to get stuck at the start line. The green light doesn't go off as fast as you want. The camera's closer than they thought they were going to be. So all these variables exist, but what you can control is the system to go through that and being able to like recheck yourself. And so breathing techniques, just finding whatever, there's lots of examples that I could give you, but it was just being able to recenter myself over and over again, which at the beginning was really hard. Like I was really nervous a lot, but by the end of my career, like I could have anything really happen and I would be fine to just be like, oh, recollect. Like I had things like the clock didn't stop when I crossed the line one time, like on my sled in a race, and I had to go back up to the top and race again. And it was probably one of the most stressful things ever. But I remember like being ready, like on the truck ride back up, I was like, it's fine, we're going again. Later, I probably was having, a post heart attack because I realized how stressed I'd been. But you just find this space within yourself to be able to control yourself for as long as you need to. And then later have space to decompress, because there are going to be emotions that you have kind of kept down because you needed to. And so that's the second part of this is like, have some place to put those. Don't just act like, oh, it's cool, I can handle everything. It's all right. We're all human beings. You might be sad, you might be happy, you might be angry. Like find ways to healthily deal with those things. It might be talking about them. It might be painting or yelling or whatever. But so I think that's one of the one of the things that I learned along the way. Hindsight's 2020. I'm sure there's things I could have done that were better, but knowing now that there were elements of that along the way.
Right. And your point about constantly trying to recenter yourself because there are so many distractions, but then being able to find that process that you can trust. What sort of interactions would you be having with yourself in your own mind right before a race?
Yeah, so was kind of a bit of a, in terms of energy levels, it was a bit of an inverted pyramid. So the beginning of so say the day of the race, the beginning of the day was really broad. This is how we looked at it. I wouldn't think about much of the race. You were getting ready for it, you packed your bags, but think of it. So as I said, like inverted pyramid, top of it's very broad. Your thoughts are very broad. And a couple hours before the race, you're starting to get a little tighter. You're thinking about things, but you're still just keeping it light, not worrying too much about it. An hour before the race, now, okay, so now your sled set up, now you're getting warmed up, things are getting more focused. You might have headphones in, you might be really like getting ready. And then that 30 minutes before you go, things are getting tighter. You really know you're starting to visualize a lot more. 20, 10, 5 minutes before, you're like really fine tuned. It's the only thing you're thinking about. Everything else doesn't matter. It's just this next 1 minute of your life that you're going to have as soon as you step up to the block. That's what you're thinking about. But I remind people, and I talk about this a lot with visualization, I'm not just visualizing when things go well. Okay, so there's a perfect line, quote unquote, down each track. Changes every year, depends on how everything's shaped and carved. And so all kinds of variables there too. But there's a perfect line that day that you think you might be able to find. It's pretty unlikely you're going to get there. All you're doing is making mistakes in this sport. So it's whoever makes the least amount of mistakes. So the other part about this is visualizing the mistakes as well. And you'll know as an athlete, like where you're making those mistakes most often. So you visualize those as well. And as weird as that sounds to think about making mistakes right before you go, it prepares your brain for all the possible solutions so that when it happens, it's not a surprise. Your brain's like, oh, I already know what to do. So when you're traveling 100 to 140 kilometers per hour, like I don't have time to think about what I'm doing. I have time to react. That's it. And if your brain's already programmed to react in all situations, then it will react accordingly and you can still make it work.
That's really insightful to understand how each athlete approaches the sport. And in terms of, again, still talking about the preparation and going into the race, would you say you are an athlete that tries to psych yourself up before the race or go within and try and compose yourself and approach the race really calmly?
There's a fine line. If I got too excited, I tested it a few times. If I got too excited, I couldn't calm myself down fast enough. So some athletes would test like caffeine pills or things like that, things that were like a legal stimulant. I found that no chance my nervous system would be through the roof and I couldn't calm down. The weirdest thing about skeleton, and the only other sport that I've ever really heard that it's similar to, is biathlon, where you are jacking your heart rate up so high because you're full out sprinting for 5 to 6 seconds, right? So much like a biathlete who will be skiing super hard and their heart rate be, and then they have to either stand or lay down to shoot. We have to lay down on our sleds and immediately get your heart rate down to like resting, within milliseconds, like get in, get down, calm down. So if you're super jacked up before you push, it might help your push, but if you're over that threshold, whatever that may be for you, you won't be able to calm down fast enough and you're already through a couple corners. The race is done. You don't have enough time to make up. So for me, I would say it was more about staying happy and light than it was about whether or not I was really excited. I was always nervous, like nerves, again, that fear that's good, but panicked about what might happen or worrying about external things, that never worked out for me. And getting too jacked up would also not work. So sometimes you see and you see it a lot with, I would say, like bobsled break men and women. They're getting very, very jacked up, like smacking themselves and just like yelling. Well, they don't have to drive. Like the break people get in after this hard push and just hold on. And despite what Cool Running showed you, nobody's moving in the sled. Nobody's banking left and right. Like they're tucking down and just breathing, like trying to hold on for dear life. Whereas the pilot of a bobsled, as well as a pilot of a skeleton sled, like we're the ones doing everything to the sled. So you really need to be in control. So for me, it was about maintaining that level of consistency with a little bit of like happiness. And if I was telling jokes and laughing, you knew that the day was going to go well.
Right. And that's one place where you haven't taken your skills and traits of being a track and field athlete, because we always see them trying to psych themselves up and try to get the crowd involved with all the rhythmic clapping and all. So yeah.
Yeah, like as a multi-eventer, I think it was nice because so heptathletes travel in a group, right? All the women would be together. So it isn't quite the same as like a final for the 100 or a final for long jump. Like, sure, we get people involved, but you're already with a group and everybody there is like suffering together. So there was a different dynamic for me, my experience in track and field. I later transitioned into 400-meter hurdles, like for the last 2 years of my career, which was a whole different race because that probably like began my understanding of being alone out there. Because you'd go out, you'd set up yourself in the staggered, and you just know there was like 10 brutal hurdles coming at you at a full speed, 1 lap outdoor race. And you were going to be in pain no matter what after hurdle 5, like no matter how good you're doing. And nobody was there to care when you finished. They were just hoping they beat you, right? And so I think there was a little bit of that and learning how to self-soothe before, and that probably came into play later. I don't think I've really thought about it, but yeah, there was a bit of a transition in track and field for me too.
And we definitely see some overlaps from your previous sports as well, but coming back to the national team with skeleton as well, getting trained by one of the greats of the sport, Melissa Hollingsworth, what would you say was your biggest learning from the time of training with her?
Yeah, getting to train with Mel and with Sarah and even John Montgomery, like these Olympians, right? Who you're just like, oh, okay. And the other person that really was helpful was Jeff Payne, who's another Olympian. Oh, and Duff Gibson was also one of my coaches. So, here I am standing around these great Olympians, some of the medalists, like unbelievable. Melissa and I knew who she was right away, right? Because once you start the sport, you know who these real big time players were, and becoming close as a group of female sliders was really important for me because I still to this day am very much a team athlete more than I am an individual athlete. So we would joke because Melissa had grown up in skeleton more than anything, right? And between that and some equestrian background, she was more of an individual athlete. And I think seeing that dynamic with her and I, where I desperately wanted to be a group and she was kind of hesitant, and she would say the same thing, I think, but we found a common ground as a group, believing that we were doing this together. Even though we were all there for ourselves, we were all there for our own results, and watching her go through her processes and understanding how she really had so much less to have to think about by the time I got to the World Cup level. She knew the track, she knew what she was doing, but I also watched her try a new sled, and that experience for her was like really daunting. And I know that it was hard. So it was good for me to see that those people are still willing to learn, those really like high up, those elusive athletes that we think about, but they're still people, and Mel's still a person and she's still my friend. And there are these people that, I think we put them on these crazy pedestals, but they're dealing with all the same things that you are at whatever level, just at a different gauge, right? So their bar changes because they've changed it for themselves. Where you place them in your mind maybe even more higher than that, but just know professional athletes have the same issues that you do. They just don't showcase them in the same way. And in lots of places they have more help. And sometimes that just means because they are able to ask for it. So that's kind of my takeaway from that.
And preparing for Sochi, what did you feel when the Canadian Federation, decided not to participate in the race that could have sealed actually a third sled for Canada at the Olympics as well, meaning that there could be 3 sleds competing in the Olympics and increasing the chances of higher representation from the country?
Yeah, it was the first time that we didn't, right? And then it happened again. It's kind of started that decision. It wasn't the catalyst per se, but it certainly has started a very strange result for Team Canada. And that's kind of a broad step back to like what happened after that. How did I feel was your question though. And I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed. Like a lot of things went into those months leading up to that. One of them was that a year prior, I wouldn't have thought I was even going to be considered. And then going into that year, 8th in the world, realizing like, yeah, I deserve to be there, and really, really wrapping my head around that. But that was the hardest lesson for me, was recognizing after the fact, years later, that we get told as kids, you work hard, you do what you're told, you're going to get what you want. That's not always the case. That's not always the case. And sometimes there are external realities that you can't control. It was heartbreaking. I definitely fell into a depression post that decision, and I didn't know how to manage it, and I didn't know who to go to, and I didn't know what to do. And so instead I just kept pushing. Like, it just kept being like, okay, well, I'm going to try for the next ones, I guess. And I had won a lot of races right up to that very moment, and could have, should have, would have. There's a million things I could say right now that I could have done the week before that happened. But in the end, it wasn't my decision to make. And, you know, the health and safety of the athletes was the first and foremost for the priority of the team. I, however, didn't have any concussion issues. And it was very frustrating for me to know that I could have gone over and been healthy and raced, at least tried to challenge for my own spot, but it wasn't meant to be. And I had to find a way to accept that. And very candidly, I didn't accept it for a very long time. It was something that shattered my confidence and my perception of self for many years.
And there being no third sled obviously had a very high implication on you not making to the Olympics, but while you were named as an alternate but did not get a chance to race at the Olympics. How did you navigate that time going through that Olympics while being an alternate, but after the Olympics were over, knowing that you did not get a chance to compete there, even though you had worked equally hard to be there and almost deserved to be there, being world number 8 at that time?
Yeah, the navigation was strange. I don't think I could even tell you exactly how I went through it. It's a bit of a blur. Sometimes I have like memories of those months, of that month of February in 2014. Like, I didn't even watch the race. I think I watched some of it. It was a hard thing for me to wrap my head around. I wanted to know what had happened. So I think I did catch some of it, but it wasn't like a get up in the middle of the night kind of thing and trying to watch live. I went home, and I was home with my mom and dad for a little bit. I surrounded myself with people that, you know, that love me no matter what. I guess that's probably the best way to put it. And just tried to distance myself from it all. I would have loved to be there and still experience it. But in some ways, the way that the Sochi Russia games like went scandal wise, like afterwards, in terms of all the doping, it's hard for me to not go like, well, maybe that was why, like, you know, maybe it's okay that I didn't go. Maybe there wasn't any question. Because at the same time, we're having athletes who are getting medals now for an Olympics from years and years ago, right? Because of changes. So, you know, again, hindsight's always 2020, but navigating that time was just simply like the best thing I could do was be with people that loved me and just try and take that time to just exist. I didn't seek anything else out. I didn't ask for a lot of help. Sometimes I think I should have, but some of my real focus was making sure that no one else was upset, which just seems silly. But I was really, I felt like I let everyone down. Like, I let the country down. I let my family down. I let all my friends down. People had already paid for tickets to go to Russia. Like, all kinds of things had happened. And none of that was my responsibility, but it felt like it was. And so managing those emotions and just being a human being, like, I was sad. I was really sad. And it's okay. It's okay that I didn't have to just be like, it's no big deal. Like, it was a huge deal. It was the Olympics, right? So yeah, I did my best is the short answer to that question.
And kudos to you for obviously navigating it at your best ability. But much after Russia, how would you say you realigned your goals within the career of skeleton as well and outside? Were there any other interests that you started looking at, or were you still equally driven and had newer goals to chase down?
Yeah, I think I was still very uniquely focused on skeleton. I still really wanted to continue, but the one phrase that just kept coming back to mind for me was that I wasn't going to quit, because I thought about quitting. I thought about just being done. I was like, well, maybe I won't go back. But basically, I didn't want to leave any stone unturned. So I didn't believe I'd done everything I could at that point. And I knew that there was alternatives to try in terms of coaching, in terms of sleds, and finding those funding. So basically, it was at all costs. That was my reality. I was going to find out whether or not I was going to be able to go or not go, or achieve this goal or not, one way or another, no matter what. So I did. So I hired, and at the risk of potentially in some spheres looking very much like the black sheep, I went against the grain. I did the things I wasn't supposed to do. I had private coaches. I did what I wanted. I just told them that's what I was going to do, even when I was told I wasn't supposed to, because I knew that I could affect the change for myself. And if I'm supposed to worry about myself, then that's what I was going to do. And after those Olympics, the sport of skeleton lost a ton of money. Like there was absolutely none left. We went from like $14 million or something to like zero. So everyone got fired. There was a huge overhaul, and all the Olympians that had gone to the 2014 games would retire, except I stayed. And so I was the only remaining name from that potential list. And as far as the funding names would go, they were just like, well, who are you? So you went from being very well known to, in many ways, being a no one again. So I was like, all right, well, then I'll prove myself from here. And that was my focus, to just, whether it was proving it to myself or proving it to other people, I needed to see, and I needed to do everything in my capacity to decide for myself.
That's how you started training towards the 2018 Olympics then. But 7 months before the 2018 Olympics, you decided to retire. What led you to that decision of retiring from the sport, knowing that you had almost 3 years after Russia to, basically try and give that dream another shot?
Yeah, I did. I gave it everything I could. There was a lot of bureaucracy involved. There were a lot of decisions that were still being made for the team, for the future of the sport. And those decisions were really affecting my position. I was being asked to prove myself over and over and over again on my own dime at races that were by no means on any radar of anyone's. They were very low level races with no support, with no understanding of why, whether or not, and even if I was to win a race, would that for sure give me the result that I needed? So like, could I get back on the World Cup team then? I would remake selection teams a couple years, like after selections, 2 years after the 2014 games. And we had new standards. I pushed a standard that I'd never pushed before. I made the team again. And then they took the third World Cup sled away from us. Things like that, where you're like, but why? I even had stepped forward and said, I'll pay for my own coach. I'll pay for myself to go. And it was still like, no, you can't go. And in the sport of skeleton, you have to have your federation. So your country has to submit your name. So you can't just show up at a race and race at them. So if you're not on the list, you can't race. It's like, they won't open the gate for you. So I got to the point where I realized that I was fighting a losing battle and I was done. I had kind of done my last attempt at another request from the federation to do a race off and was unsuccessful. It doesn't matter. Conditions were crazy. Both of myself and the other athlete that were racing were both like hesitant to even race. It wasn't really safe. But that said, you know what, like when the race was done and the dust settled and I realized that meant I was gonna have to stay on a lower circuit again. I just realized that it wasn't what I wanted anymore. I wasn't having fun. I wasn't myself. Like my personality was really changing and had changed probably. And in a lot of ways I hadn't dealt with the pain and the trauma that I had felt and created in myself too from the 2014 games. And it was time to stop and take care of me again.
Right. After retirement and then having the benefit of hindsight, what would you say was your highlight of your career and the achievement that you hold the closest to your heart?
I think there's a couple, but one that stood out right away when you asked that was the first time I won. No, there's two. Okay. The one that I'm thinking of first isn't a race. It was before I made the national team. And it was the first time I showed that I was as good as I knew I could be. So I was forerunning for a World Cup race in Whistler. So this is like an untelevised thing. It's like folklore. This happened. I have a timesheet though.
Urban legends.
That's right. So forerunners go down before any of the athletes to test the ice and the timing eyes. So their times aren't shown on TV and they do still get tracked in the timing eyes and they do show up on the finish, like you can see them. So all the athletes can see how fast the athlete went. It gives the athletes an idea of how fast the track is. But a lot of times the athletes that are forerunners are newer athletes and they may be making more mistakes, but you still get an idea of the track and it tests all the electric timing eyes, like the laser timing beams. So I was a Canadian forerunner for a World Cup event and I had been training there for a few weeks and was loving. Whistler was always the scary track for everyone because it's fast and it's really steep and hard. And I loved it. I've never, ever been afraid of that track. And I was ready to showcase. And I'd been jokingly racing some of the men all week in other countries, like just giving them an advantage and, all these things. And the time that I put down on that first 4-run heat would have placed me in the top 3 of that race. And that was the moment that I like people's comments and the way that people started treating me differently after that. It was just like this realization for myself above all that like, I can do this. Like I have figured it out. This is where I belong. And it's time to start believing that. And so, that would change my mindset from like, I'm a rookie, I don't know what I'm doing, to the next October coming out and like winning selections at the exact same track.
Right. That was the first one. You'd mentioned the second one as well. I'd love to hear that.
Second one, yeah. The second one was winning selections at that same track. So honestly, I had a women's push, like a push record there, which is the other super strange thing. Again, not a supernatural fast pusher. I'd always try and be in the top 10 just to give myself a chance to, because I could always drive really well. But I broke the women's standing push record that final run. So it was like heat 2. I was still in first place. So I was last off on the second heat. And I remember like to myself, I was just saying, yes. Like I was just like, yes, yes. In my helmet, in my head over and over. And I just pushed like I'd never pushed before and got to the bottom. And suddenly I had a push record and I won selections. And I was like, what? It was this realization that I just knew I could. And I did it.
Right. And now that you have retired, you've been putting your journalism degree to great use, working with CBC to cover the sport of skeleton from time to time. And you're working as a content and marketing manager as well. If there is one thing that I've gotten to know from all the research that I have done on your career, it is that you keep trying different things and always experiment and yearn for new experiences. What sort of aspirations do you have now with journalism and otherwise as well?
Yeah, reinventing myself has been kind of my like middle name for some reason. I don't do it because I don't love who I am. I do it because I realize that you get one life, and I contradict the idea of creating one version of that and saying like, this is it, tuck in, that's me forever. We're always evolving, we're always growing. So in terms of my journalism career, like it's always been kind of reinvented, but at the same time, for me, the aspirations remain consistently in storytelling, in sharing my experiences. So there is some aspirations for me to, maybe write a book. I've been a speaker many, many times, and I would like to continue doing that. This year has been a little more challenging, but if anyone's listening and they want to hear this story, or I've done a ton of business speaking as well as, keynote speaking, and I love that stuff, but I would like to have a bigger presence in the sports world as a broadcaster in some capacity, because being able to tell those sports from the lens of understanding, you don't have to be doing the sport itself to understand what these athletes are going through, and getting a really good interview is few and far between in the sporting world. There's usually just very basic questions, and that's what you get told. And so I always feel like there's so much to be said there. And the human connection that sport creates is like everlasting, which is why I am a content marketer, but at the same time, it's storytelling for businesses. And it's that human element of being able to connect people through some common thread, and finding what those are is, and has always been, one of my passions.
Right. And I totally agree. I think, like you mentioned, the really quality kind of journalism in sports is definitely lacking. And that's one of the reasons why I also started this podcast, because I, as a viewer of any sport, I'm always trying to understand what the athlete is feeling and thinking at that time, right before that crucial moment. And the perspective that you'd be able to bring as a journalist in that conversation, you'd obviously be able to tap into your experience and at least shed some light on what the athlete could be thinking in that crucial moment right before they, set off.
Yeah. I think that we idolize, or at least the media asks us to idolize, a lot of very strange people in the like movie stars and things like that. Like they're still human beings. So are athletes. And all of them are just like you. And so that silly like tabloid section, they're just like us, where it shows pictures of them doing things that you do. Well, guess what? Everyone's like that. And I think that's what's missing, is this belief in our mind that that's them, like that's a them thing, and this is us over here. Well, no, like they have all the exact same realities as you do. They've just used them differently. And athletics is no different. So being able to ask those questions to athletes and phrase them in a way that would get an answer that lands for everyone, instead of just being like, oh, how'd you feel out there? Like, great work on that second quarter. Like, what's the plan for the third quarter? Like, who cares? Why don't you ask what they're really thinking? Or like, yeah. So I think challenging that norm and this is the way we've always done it, like, has to stop. There are lessons to be learned through all these experiences. And it isn't that you're not good enough. It is possible that anything is possible. Even if some shit gets in your way, like, it's still possible. You could still create something because you're going to learn something from that experience to be able to turn your next experience into something new.
Absolutely. And I hope that there are a lot more reporters and journalists trying to adopt that view. So thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for taking out the time today. It was an incredibly insightful conversation. I got to learn a lot about skeleton as a sport, as well as what it takes to be a successful skeleton athlete, and not just a skeleton athlete, but a successful athlete as a whole, and what all traits should one look for in a successful athlete, what kind of mindset that one needs to develop. And I'm definitely taking away the learnings of trying to reinvent yourself. Obviously, the life is too short to be just having one version of yourself. So thank you so much for generously sharing your insights and learnings with us.
Well, thank you so much for asking all these great questions and for being curious enough to do so. And I just want to leave one parting thought, is that, to your point, I want people to start calling themselves athletes in general. You know, it's not like getting a doctorate. You don't become a doctor. Like, you are an athlete. If you do athletic things, like, you are an athlete. Don't be like, oh, I'm not really a runner, I just run sometimes. Like, nope, you're a runner. So, you know, the things that you're going to listen to on this podcast, on other episodes, like, all of these insights from any athlete who's ever done athletics at a high level are things that you can figure out and things that you can tap into for whatever athletic version of your life that you want to live.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the things that I try and imbibe, because it's not just an athlete mindset that you adopt on the field. You could apply the athlete mindset to the professional life as well, to a personal life as well. And the applicability is so universal, and everybody has a lot to learn from that athlete mindset as a whole. So thank you so much for taking on the time again and sharing all these details with us about your career, about how you are as an individual. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have a lot to learn from you.
Awesome. Well, it was my pleasure. And I look forward to connecting with anyone and everyone very soon.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, that was such a refreshing conversation. Cassie's energy is really infectious. And I'm certain that she used her abundance of energy to her advantage when she was competing as well. It was intriguing to learn from her perspective on how she dealt with federation decisions that restricted her from sealing her spot at the Olympics and fulfilling her dream. And how do you move on from such decisions that are clearly not under our control and continue focusing on the performance, because at the end of the day, that is the only variable that the athletes can control. As promised, here's more about our partnership with Zenkai Sports, the new disruptor in the performance apparel world. Zenkai utilizes a brand new technology that repels liquids, keeping you cooler during intense activity as the sweat evaporates naturally off your skin. This allows you to regulate body temperature easily and push yourself harder, as Zenkai clothing harnesses the power of your sweat. Sweat is our friend, keep it on you. Zenkai Sports is also the only performance apparel company which is cotton based. All of their gear is over 65% cotton, with some pieces over 95%. Cotton is biodegradable, feels great against your skin, and is much better for our environment than synthetic based apparel. Please go to www.zenkaisports.com to check out their cool range of products that can give you that extra boost in your performance. And while you are at it, use the code TGP20 for a 20% discount off your entire order. You can also find all these details in our show notes of this episode, so don't forget to check it out. So that's it for this episode, folks. Thank you for tuning into the Gifted Podcast. I have been your host, Niraj Mulani. A gentle reminder You can find us as The Gifted on your favorite podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and Google. Keep following us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Gifted Podcast and on Twitter as The Gifted Pod so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Thank you once again for listening, and I'll see you next week with another special episode. Until then, stay well and keep your masks on.